lot of skew seats which are not being used in the middle. Could people put their hands up so that people at the sides can sit comfortably? Come along. Sit comfortably. Come on, sit comfortably, my dears. You can't even see there. It's not a question of whether you're comfortable or not. It's a question of whether you can actually see. Your sight lines are so lousy. I know a lot of you want to slip out the moment the lights goes down, but that's not your affair. Yes. Oh, you're just holding your hand up. Yeah. Come on. That's better. All right. I trust that you all understand what else has to be done. The papers have to be in now, and people who haven't brought their papers in, unless they made a special arrangement, will simply be forgotten. The other thing is the test takes place on Wednesday, which is the 12th, and A's to K's come at 10 o'clock, and L's to Z's come at 8:30. And I thought I was being very good-natured and giving the second half of the alphabet an advantage. But of course it isn't really an advantage to have to come at 8:30 rather than at 10 o'clock. I apologize that once more the Z's are in a diseased position. But I simply can't help that. I intended to be nice, and I just simply failed. I shall get through this lecture exceedingly fast because we have some gormandizing to do at the end of it. And we just simply have to hope that the loaves and the fishes will produce at least 12 baskets of leftovers. Good evening, goodbye. Good evening, goodbye. I need to have a lasso or something. I need to have a huge net or something. What would it be if I just suddenly decided to give the test now? Trouble is I got the wrong slides. So anyhow, you had pomp and circumstance, and you're going to have some more pomp and circumstance. Let's have the lights down. This large moustache, which is actually very like the portrait of Edward Elgar. And towards the end of the 19th century, large and fruity moustaches were very much in. And they may have been in because people thought, like Friedrich Nietzsche, that a large and fruity moustache might make you into some kind of Superman. But he was, you see, a very important and fascinating philosopher. He doesn't write philosophy in a very formal kind of way, any more than Kierkegaard had written philosophy in a very formal kind of way. Kierkegaardian philosophy and Nietzschean philosophy is irregular, obeys different formal ideas, and gets away from academic philosophy. Anyhow, the important thing about Nietzsche in this respect is that he takes up arms against the notion of Christianity, just as Swinburne had done. You remember how Swinburne characterizes Christianity: "Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean, the world has grown grey at thy breath," which is in fact a paraphrase of Julian the Apostate, but it suggests the disenchantment with Christianity at the latter part of the 19th century. Well, Nietzsche is disenchanted with Christianity, but it goes one stage further. Nietzsche identifies two basic principles, and you know how we all identify two basic principles. You know, the Chinese identify yin and yang, and we usually identify men and women, hot and cold, ping and pong, and all that kind of thing. And the Nietzschean one is an enormously important one. What he identifies, let's have a look at the next slide, is the Apollonian, and here is a very famous Hellenistic sculpture of Apollo, and this particular sculpture is a kind of open sesame to neoclassicism. And think for a moment of neoclassicism as a system, an idea enforcing mathematical, geometric, numeral order, enforcing a super kind of rationalism, enforcing a control of the emotions, enforcing a sense of balance, and standing really, in a way, at the gateway of modern science, as well as in the 18th century towards the end, as a gateway few people entered through into the realms of art. And then opposed to the Apollonian, with its calmness, its serenity, its sense of formal structure, the Dionysiac. And Nietzsche opposed the Dionysiac. And indeed, let's have a look at the next. For the 19th century, he really rediscovered Dionysus. And you all know who Dionysus was in just a slightly different garb, or lack of garb. Who is this? This is the immortal drunkard, the lovely Bacchus. And the Dionysiac is that excited, irrational, dark side, the side of maenads and furies and orgies and porgies and gorgies and so on and so forth, that other kind of world which in Western civilization is constantly being submerged by man's wonderful love of order. And so you can see that what Nietzsche does by using these two classical gods, Apollo and Dionysus, is to identify two principles of art, two alternative ways of shaping the universe. One, man's rage for order, and the other, man's rage for chaos. The calm of the day and the turbulence of the night. And I suggest to you, let's have a look at the next, that the great Nietzsche, therefore, look at him again. This is a posthumous portrait. He died raddled with syphilis after a really rather short life. Very curious person. He's been accused of being the grandfather of Nazism. He's accused of being a tremendous anti-Semite. He is, in fact, a very difficult, complicated, and blathering philosopher. But these two alternative principles have become, I think, ingrained in 20th century sensibility and 20th century ways, not only of looking art, but of creating art. And of course, they are not mutually excluded from any single person's psychological dower. I'm going to show you how this can work very, very simply. This is surely Dionysiac rather than Apollonian, isn't it? It is by Boccionni, and of course it is one of the great classic works of futurism, done round about 1911, 1912, when the Italians, who of course were the most unhappy nation in Europe in terms of their artistic dower. Because, I mean, what is it? I mean, it's bad enough for English people to have Shakespeare in their background. I mean, you know, who is ever going to write a play as good as Shakespeare? American poets can write poetry pretty well as good as Walt Whitman any day of the week. But it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult to write a play as good as Shakespeare. A lot of 19th century people tried. But if for the Italians, now it is, you know, can you be as good as Titian and Raphael and Caravaggio and Masaccio and Michelangelo and Tintoretto and Correggio and Giorgione and Bellini? I mean, pretty good hell. And so it is not surprising that the Italians spawned the most significant in some ways of 20th century art movements, Futurism, which is the most deliberate attempt to produce an art which is directed not towards the past but entirely towards the future. It's an art of speed, it's an art of machinery, it's an art of destruction of the old order. Nowhere in the whole history of 20th century art is the explicit nature of the hatred of the past greater than in Futurism, and Futurism spreads from Italy through the personality of Marinetti to France, to England, to Russia, to Germany, all over the Western world, and then of course through people like Picabia and so on, it eventually spreads to the United States. And here is a pretty Dionysic piece of sculpture. Of course, it's also very much deeply concerned with that whole notion of movement. And the real question as to how irrational it is not so easy finally to decide. And one of our problems about the 20th century is we see a lot of art which looks as though it's irrational, but it turns out perhaps to be more Apollonian than you think. Let's have a look at the next. Anyhow, you feel a sense of contrast, because this is surely Apollonian and not in the least the absolute failure to control violent impulses, which release violent impulses in the looker, the absolute sort of orgiastic overeating quality of the Dionysiac. Indeed, what you might say, the Dionysiac becomes simply the sick. And you're some way towards the sick in this particular thing, and you really wouldn't know where the ladies was, or the gents, or the powder room, or indeed almost anything, and you're almost bound to be spat on by these Bacchic little creatures here, and so on and so forth. But you begin to get an idea of the possibility of organizing your ideas of 20th century art and 20th century life round these notions. Well, what I now want to do is to return to the Impressionists, and here we have our Impressionist sculptor, Medard Rosso, and then think of perhaps the greatest structuralist of the late 19th century. And I use structuralist not in philosophical sense, but simply in the sense of somebody who wished to give painting a degree of formality, a degree of geometric legibility, a degree of firmness. It is the great name of Paul Cezanne. And you all know that Paul Cezanne, let's have a look at the next slide, was, do you see, an artist who, while a painter, had a deep sculptural interest. And here's one of his still lifes, which pays homage to that sculptural interest. I wish people would not be moving around too much. It is so distracting, dears. Do please sit down somehow, my dear fellow. The fact is that in another epoch, I'm pretty certain Cezanne would have been a sculptor. He was, in fact, of course, the son of an Italian-descended banker in Aix-en-Provence. And had he not had a father who was reasonably well off, he might well have been an organ grinder or a petty clerk. Had he followed his father's wishes, of course, he would have become an attorney, probably a businessman. But from the start, he has such a fascinating dower. There is something profoundly Dionysiac about Cezanne, so Dionysiac, but so extreme that he daren't ever let it really get out of control in his life. And if you read biographies of him, they're very fascinating. One of the things that you become very conscious of is he has this intense in his art desire for tactility. He has a most terrible fear of ever touching another human being. And in his mature life, you know, a pat on the back will send him running to the railway carriage to go back home to Aix immediately. He is frightfully frightened of physical contact. He does eventually have a mistress whom he eventually marries. He does have a son. Common art criticism says that he paints those people as though they were apples or pears. And of course, a pear or an apple is a wonderfully tactile but wonderfully safe object, whereas a chest or an elbow or a bosom is equally tactile but a damn sight more dangerous and inflaming. And so he's a complicated person to understand. Let's have a look at the next. And his very passion, I think, tends to make his art in its early phases extremely clumsy. One of his school friends is Zola, and it is clear that Cézanne has a powerful mind, but is in the grip of a much deeper sense of the difficulty of life and the appalling horror of gaining some meaning out of it. He's a person who has a much deeper sensitivity as well as a deeper passion than Zola. Zola goes off to Paris, and in no time at all he's a successful journalist. Cézanne goes off to Paris, and in no time at all he's a spectacularly unsuccessful art student. And you know, I mean, amongst art students it's easy to be spectacularly unsuccessful, but Cézanne really took the biscuit. I mean, his life drawings were so passionately incompetent. And his early paintings, you see, he has this love for pigment, and you can see in this is a painting of his uncle Dominique. And look at something which you simply have not really seen in 19th century painting, a kind of gluttonous approach to pigment, a kind of heaviness in the drawing, a kind of boding quality in the black, and look at the distortion of this lower lip. Here is somebody who doesn't smile. The best he can do is slobber like a bulldog, because of the passionate desire which Cézanne has to do justice to the paint and a certain quality in his uncle. So he piles it up with the heaviest kind of impasto with his palette knife. Let's have a look at the next. And here's another one which is seen a little closer to, and you can actually feel, can you not, the pigment. And that kind of pigmental approach you can find, for instance, in a 1950 artist like Soulage, or the French artist Talcote, a thickness in the actual use of the matière, which is sculptural, you see. And if only, you might say, Cézanne had seized a piece of marble, because he had a kind of physical ferocity, which you can sense in all the photographs of him. He might so easily have gone in that direction. Once again, the color is not interested in anything impressionist. Now, think about this. It's the 1860s, and Monet and Manet and Renoir are beginning to discover the pleasures of the prism. Cézanne is much, much, much slower to grasp that, though it's interesting just here on the nose already. You have that interest in a pure-ish pigment which is modeling the volumes in color. And notice one other thing. Cézanne from the start has this passionate love of volumes. This is a very volumetric painting. Let's have a look at the next, please. Here's one of his father, and throughout his life, poor Cézanne was one of those people who had a father complex. You can either have a father complex or a mother complex or a second cousin complex. I much recommend the last, because you're a little further away from it. Or you can have a complex for fleas, also quite safe. But he has a papa complex, and here he does a portrait of his father. Look at the way in which, even at this stage, there's a passionate interest in very, very solid forms. Cézanne is not interested in the wrinkles of the trouser. He loves the hemispherical quality of the skull cap. And he likes the richest kind of simplification, and there's something further. He has a deep sense of those fundamental Apollonian ideas, the coordinates of horizontals and verticals. So we can see there's a geometric, let's have a look at the next, there's a geometric side to Cézanne. Not to this is not a Cézanne, by the way. I'm sure you grasp that immediately. Furthermore, of course, Cézanne wanted to be part of the establishment. And this was part of the establishment. This was Cabanel's Venus in 1863, just as, you see, let's have a look at the next. Manet has his 1863 affair, and Cézanne wanted to join. The most tragic thing about Cézanne was that he wanted to be a conventional success, but was far too great and far too difficult a figure to be a conventional success. And just let me warn you that you can be a tremendous conventional failure without being a great person. Anyhow, so we've seen how complex his dower is. I suspect that Cézanne at one stage would love to have painted like this, with its total control of academic drawing, with its enormous lusciousness. This is by an English painter called Fred Leighton, with its intense sensuality. But when Cézanne tries to do something which will have that burning sexual pleasure to it, what happens? He does one of the clumsiest paintings of a rape in the history of that extraordinary subject matter. And this is done towards the end of the 1860s, and the symbolism is so obvious: the pinky orangey man, the white girl, the erectness of the male figure, the swooning of the female figure, and then this extraordinary ugly sea of blue paint as both these creatures swoon into some kind of cruel orgasmic situation. And throughout the 1860s, this preoccupation is part of Cézanne's world. And here's another one which we know as the orgy. And it looks a little bit like this, but I don't suppose you... Wait a moment, go back for a moment. It looks a little bit like this, but I don't suppose you would oblige with all of this, would you? But you can see it has some kind of relationship to Veronese, but it is extraordinarily disordered. And one of Cézanne's terrible difficulties is to bring his volcanic temperament under control. And let's have a look at the next, and I think he does it most of all through the medium of still life. And one of the things you might like to think about is the development of still life from the 18th to the 20th century. We've seen it in the 18th century with Chardin as a very minor form of painting. Cézanne lifts that minor form of painting along with Manet, along with Renoir, along with artists like Bonvin and so on, along with a lot of minor artists. He lifts it up to being. Cézanne makes an onion as important as the deity. And through onions and clocks and oranges and apples and cups, he learns, and drapery, he learns to control the excesses of his own temperament. He learns to become Apollonian. He learns to regiment the world into a structure of such powerful and yet paradoxical tangibility that he provides the basis for 20th century art. And this is one of his very, very first still lifes. As you can see, it is still caught in a world of dark and somber colors. It is still caught in a world of thick, creamy, and rather coarsely applied paint. But from 1869, when this black clock appears, let's have a look at next, through the 1870s, he gradually lightens his palette, he gradually complicates the composition, he gradually increases certain fascinating rhythms, and you can see the development of the rhythm of the pears against the eggs, and he does one other thing, and nobody is fully certain as to its sources. One of the things that happens with still life is that it stays around, and you as a painter become convinced that you know it through and through, and that you can paint it with an intense degree of naturalism. Still life is easier to paint from that point of view than the human body, which is always wriggling around, or the landscape, which is subject to the sun and the clouds and so on and so forth. Still life looks the same. But the truth is that your head is never in the same position, so that your relationship with a pear, when you're painting it, is constantly changing as you bend very slightly, as you move slightly to the right, as you move slightly to the left. So that it is not totally illogical to think of still life painting leading to the collapse of single point perspective. This is what happens with Cézanne. And you can see it already in this rather early still life of the 1870s. At one moment your eye point is quite low down. At another your eye point gets a little bit higher up. Your eye is constantly moving. Now, some people say, of course, this is just Cézanne not realizing what happens with the still life. Or they say this is Cézanne being not fully competent in the drawing of an ellipse. The evidence actually is that nothing could be further from the truth. the evidence is that on occasions, particularly, let's have a look at another one, as he gets on, he starts doing something very fascinating. He takes a coin out of his pocket and he starts tipping one particular form towards us. And you see, you look deeply into this cup. You look much more deeply into the cup than you do into this bowl. Now, of course, this ellipse is rather lower, but it is not that much lower. And eventually we'll see, let's have a look at the next, Cézanne, come on, now let's have a look at the next. We see Cézanne playing with his own eye point, playing with the planes, tilting things towards him, tilting things away from him. And as he does so, of course, it all becomes much more touchable. And there's that other thing, you have that sense of here is a person who cannot touch human beings, wanting then to touch everything else, and make everything in a painting absolutely tangible, so that he pulls the bottles at the back of the picture towards you, and then this transforms itself into a landscape where he pulls the houses towards you, he pulls the distant sea at L'Estaque towards you, he pulls distant Mont Saint-Victoire towards you, and he goes back in a way to the beginnings of the Italian Renaissance, which start, after all, with relief sculpture. And in one sense, Cézanne's paintings are relief sculpture. It is fascinating to look at Cézanne's approach to flowers. And now you can see, of course, in the 1870s, a great change in terms of color. That change in color is partly due to the effect of his friendship with Pissarro. And he paints landscapes with Pissarro. I think it's partly due to getting to know some of the still lives of Manet. But one of the things I want to draw to your attention is the extraordinary solidity of the flowers. The whole notion of a delicate, let's have a look at the next, of a delicate petal isn't quite suitable to him. And here's a very much later one. And as you can see, the foliage becomes more and more firm in its drawn structure. The flowers become more and more firm. That whole notion of the crinkliness of a particular petal, of a Japanese poppy, is alien because it's not touchable. And Cézanne, this is the middle of the 1870s one, and there's another very interesting thing which happens in Cézanne from time to time, a certain taste towards actually silly elegance. And he has to conquer that. Cézanne, in fact, is very much like a self-taught artist, and indeed he is a self-taught artist. The self-taught artists have to conquer all sorts of second-rate tendencies. And this, I think, is a second-rate tendency of the middle of the 1870s. Contrast it with this. And you see what he does is gradually give you a sense of the solidity of a pear, the solidity of an apple. And he does it, of course, not simply by simplifying the contours and accentuating those contours. You notice how he draws this and draws it and draws it. He accentuates a shadow here, he accentuates a shadow here, he provides a bounding line here, which of course is absolutely unlike Impressionist practice. And he relates, therefore, the leaves to the bounding line between vertical and horizontal, and you notice how he accents and strengthens the straight lines here. He accents all those simpler geometric forms, and then through his color, he gives you such a strong highlight at the center here. Let's have a look at another one. And here, one of the most complicated ones, with the ginger pot coming towards us with all the napery, and indeed with something very, very fascinating. The chair is levitating. How on earth has that chair risen to the ceiling? It is because Cézanne is moving closer to his canvas and further away from his canvas, and he's building up a world where illusionistic perspective of depth disappears and everything becomes somehow within reach and becomes partly a matter of understandable geometric forms. And if you were to take a small area like this, you would already see that it is astonishingly like the world which Picasso and Braque explore in Cubism from 1908 to 1912. And of course, the single most important influence of Cézanne is upon the Cubists. Here we have the famous onions, and you just simply know that they were lying around in that studio for a long time because they sprouted quite so much. And look at the cork. It's popping right out of the bottle, right towards us, and the top of the bottle, and you know, if you were thinking one, you would just simply say, this man can't draw. But if you think in a more subtle and complex way, you say this man is hovering over this table and seeing it from multiple vantage points and offering you multiple viewpoints of it, and by so doing, giving it a kind of solidity and a different aspect, a different relationship to time. Single point perspective ultimately leads to a whole notion of the instantaneous, because we never keep our heads still for more than a moment. Cézanne's works are works which are created through time. More and more and more, he would spend month after month, he would discard them, taken up, he'd return to the same motif year after year after year. And as they are actually created through time, so they give you a history. Let's have a look at the next, a history of time. And towards the end of his life, the brushstrokes get freer and freer and freer, and the paint returns, in some sense, but enormously purified, to its splendid position at the beginning of his career. There's an element of the Dionysiac return in terms of pigment. Let's have a look at the next. Well, what he does with still life, and you can see by now, he loves Rubens, he loves, on the other hand, Poussin. He has a tremendous digestion for the art of the past. He has a total rejection, let's have a look at the next, of Impressionism. Impressionism, which for a short amount of time was enormously important to him. Just after 1870, still extremely unsuccessful, still struggling with his family, he meets Pissarro, and that admirable, wise, benign, modest man takes the young, turbulent Cézanne, who's at least 10 years younger, in hand, and teaches him some elements of Impressionist practice. And perhaps the most important element of Impressionist practice that he teaches Cézanne is simply that of looking enormously hard and developing a consistent brushstroke. And you can see that Cézanne here is looking hard, and he's beginning to develop a consistent brushstroke at Auvers, where, and Pontoise, where, let's have a look at the next, Pissarro and Cézanne sometimes painted side by side. This is a Pissarro, and one of the things about it is it shows you simply how Pissarro would organize an Impressionist canvas so that it had a legible structure of horizontal and vertical. And you notice that Pissarro, perhaps more than Monet or Renoir, really likes the shapes of houses. He likes the verticals of trees. And he has a kind of thickness and glutinosity to his paint which is sympathetic to Cézanne. So in the 1870s we can see Cézanne under the influence of Pissarro, lightening his palette, learning to explore the issue of landscape, and eventually beginning to control it. And here we see the two of them. Here is Cézanne in a very characteristic self-deprecatory prose, and here is the kind old Pissarro. And here are some of Pissarro's children, of whom Pissarro had far too many, some people might say. I think Mrs. Pissarro sometimes said. And here's another Cézanne of the 1870s. Notice that he's using the disappearing road in the way that Pissarro uses it. Notice he's using the structure of the houses parallel with the picture plane as Pissarro sometimes uses them. And he's beginning to simplify, and he's beginning to make the landscape rear up and draw nearer. Another Pissarro, and of course, one of the things is Cézanne never explores river scenery. He never explores the snow, or practically never explores the snow. There are about 2 snow scenes by Cézanne. And he doesn't explore blossom. He explores mountains. He explores tree trunks. He explores those wonderful houses of the south of France, which are like lumps of sugar. He explores sculptural objects. Plum blossom is not a sculptural object. And Cézanne, snow is not a sculptural object. Pissarro can explore the snow, Cézanne hardly can. You see, here it is. Look how fascinating. When Cézanne has to explore foliage, he wants to clump it all together, make it into solid lumps. But the branches and the trunks, if he explores a bit of water, it becomes more like a mirror and now loses all its fluidity. And where the center is are the trees. It's worthwhile looking to see what Cézanne can do with a cloud. A cloud is a complicated and difficult thing for a Cézanne because Cézanne wishes to make it into a millstone. Let's have a look at the next. Again, that's late 1870s Cézanne. Let's have a look at the next. I want to show you plenty. And there's late 1870s Pissarro. And you can see that there's still a community between the two men, partly in terms of color, partly in terms of geometric shape, partly in terms of the richness of the paint. All right, well, in the early 1880s, Cézanne returns to the Mediterranean itself and does a further set of paintings at L'Estaque. And these are particularly interesting because here is Cézanne, a painter in the French tradition. You remember the French tradition of landscape goes back to the great Claude Lorraine and the wonderful distances of Claude Lorraine, which you remember Turner copied and made even more distant. How far away is the bank on the far side? Well, it's like, you go and actually look at Monterey Bay. And what does Cézanne do to Monterey Bay, or L'Estaque? He pulls it so close to you that you could spit and hit somebody on the far side of the bay. He rears it up, and notice that the color at the far side no longer has that hazy mistiness which is Claudian, which is Turnerian. All the structure, the brushstroke and the form on the far side remains very, very strong, and indeed you begin to see that the whole thing is related to a set of movements into and upwards in the landscape. Let's have a look at the next. Same thing is true here. And you see where Cézanne is almost hopelessly at sea. The smoke from the funnel, he just simply, he has no use for such a vaporous idea. But on the other hand, this wonderful red pan tile roof, look how he strengthens it, look how he formalizes, and that sense of warm sunlight and strong dark blue shadow. Kurt Butt, in his wonderful book on Cézanne, talks about the whole history of the color blue. And the color blue seems to have been a particularly magic color for Cézanne himself. Let's go and have a look at the next, please. And here is now Mont Saint-Victoire in the distance. Notice how he exaggerates the importance of the viaduct or aqueduct over here. Notice how the trees lean like asparagus sticks. Notice this extraordinary street which runs right across here, and even that distance away is still rearing up towards us. Notice the increasing pallor, lightness, and one of the things that happens with Cézanne, and we've seen how important it was for Turner, is that Cézanne discovers watercolor. And as he discovers watercolor, the last heaviness in his painting begins to disappear. He can then think in leaving paintings to some extent incomplete. He gets a different level of luminosity, and he can paint in these blobs and touches. And in his old age, he builds himself a new studio and then concentrates upon the eloquent shape of Mont Saint-Victoire, which is, you might say, his mistress. And he paints her again and again and again, sometimes with the most cavalier rapidity. And notice how from here to here is just one step, and how the direction of the brushstroke actually pulls you across, and how the whole thing is broken up into horizontals and verticals, much the same way that Mondrian will do that in 1915, 1916, 1917. I show you this one in the early 1890s. He goes to Switzerland, to Annecy, the Lake of Annecy. Now I show it to you because I wanted you to think how Monet was painting water at this stage, with all its extraordinary reflections, with all its tenuosity, with all its accretions of accident, and with all its extraordinary variety of color. And then you see the bold, rich, strong color of Cézanne, and you know it's the middle of summer, but you know that like Christ you could walk on this water. It is so solid. Let's have a look at the next. And the late Mont Saint-Victoire, and the next, just to show you how many there are. I wanted you to realize, amongst other things, how why Cézanne is such an important painter for the 20th century. It is partly, did I hear a funny noise? It is partly because Cézanne has this ambition. He would love to be a salon success, but deeper, why does he want to be a salon success? Because he wants to be part of the great tradition of European painting. And he will copy a Sebastiano del Piombo. He will say, I want to do Poussin over again after nature. He will, in fact, of course, copy more than once his great master, Delacroix. And here is his watercolor copy of Delacroix's Medea, murdering her children. And the whole point is that Cézanne has a sort of grasp of mind, you see, that means his ambition is on a titanic scale, however unsuccessful he is. Here we see his family, his father again early on, and then we see his son. And you see the tremendous dramatic change in his capacity and in his language. I think it's a mistake. Let's have a look at the next. Always suppose that Cézanne is uninterested in the personality. I'm going to show you two portraits of Victor Choquet. This isn't by Cézanne, is it? Could not be. Who is it by? It's by Renoir, isn't it? You can easily recognize Renoir. Renoir wants everything that he touches to be like the very softest of ladies' underwear. And Cézanne wants everything he touches to be like a rock. And you look at the next. And you see, look at the different approach to the hair. Renoir wants hair to be like candy floss. Like the exhalation of elephant's breath. Cézanne wants it to be like elephant's tusk. Wants it to be like elephant skin, or even rhinoceros skin. And you become aware of this as a tremendous promontory, as something sculpted, almost Mount Rushmore, something made out of the most permanent and impermeable materials, instead of fabric. He must have learned a very great deal from his own self-portraits, and here's a whole group of the self-portraits. The self-portrait in the latter part of the 19th century is so fascinating. Who is the other great self-portraitist of the latter part of the 19th century? Vincent Van Gogh, isn't he? And what else do we know is that both Vincent and Cézanne were extraordinarily lonely people, found it extremely difficult to make any kind of social contact, particularly any kind of erotic social contact. And so they're left with their paintings and they're left with themselves. And they have to learn how to paint through looking at themselves and repeating themselves again. And you can understand, of course, why Cézanne would like a Derby or a Bowler. A wonderful, wonderful painting. And how his nose relates to the brim. And how his ears relates to the brim. And how his lapels relate to the brim. And how his beard relates to the brim. And how he finds a complete grammar of comparative forms out of his own bright-eyed, fearsome, frightened, sweet, tender, terrible countenance. Let's have a look at the next. And here, more severe, more determined, up against his easel, creating such a simple arrangement of horizontals and verticals, and giving you such a sense of something indestructibly present, and made out of a new sort of material of the universe, a material which will last forever. And here's his wife, and he never treats his wife with quite the savagery that he treats himself, I don't think. But it's particularly interesting to look at the detail and see how what he's doing now, he's saying this is one plane, there's a change of plane, there's another plane, there's a change of plane, there's a change of plane. You notice how he doesn't mind accentuating the change of plane down the side of the nose into the ravine round the eye, and every face becomes a landscape with re-entrance, and mountains and dells and valleys and plains. And he sees the same kind of tactility on the human face as he can see upon his mistress Mont Sainte-Victoire, as he can see upon an apple or a pear or a pomegranate. Finally, of course, he stalks, and this is so important, he stalks the very highest range and realm of art. He hasn't forgotten those rapes, he hasn't forgotten those orgies, but he now wants to make them into something stupendous and permanent and extraordinary. And so he starts in the 1870s, he's bathing women. And at this stage they frolic about in a totally mad kind of way, and you can see how unhappy he is with clouds. Here is a cloud with eyes and its tongue out. All these other clouds, I mean, they're impossible and dreadful objects. And the trees, which are done obviously from the imagination, are absolutely theatrical. And there's an element of tinsel in Cézanne, an element of the theatric, which he has bit by bit to overcome. And we can see that. Let's have a look. And he also has to calm his bathers down. From rumpling each other, they calm down towards splashing each other. And you begin to get a sense of the surrounding trees, squashing them into triangular situation. And they themselves become more and more simply monumental. Let's go on, and they get yet more monumental. Here they are. Their faces no longer have any great significance. It is the movements of their bodies, and actually the concatenation of the movement of one body to another body, to the limbs of trees and the heavy foliage, till finally at the end of his life he creates the extraordinary famous image of the baigneurs, the grand baigneurs, the great bathers, which goes back to Poussin, goes back to Raphael. It is a Poussin done over against nature, and it is, of course, the stepping stone for young Master Picasso and the Demoiselle, let's go on, because that's another Cézanne, the Demoiselle d'Avignon. So that you can see how important the career of Cézanne is. Equally important, in my view, the much less heralded, vaunted, is the career of Seurat, who is, let's have a look at the next, who is also, of course, concerned with that recreation of a geometry, recreation of structure. Seurat only lives to the age of 31. His epoch is the epoch of the 1880s. Cézanne lives until 1906. During the course of the 1880s, Seurat paints about 5 paintings of extraordinary magnificence, vast self-discipline, and fascinating technique. He is the most direct heir, if you like, of the Impressionists. That is to say, he's fascinated by optical issues, he's fascinated by the issue of color, and he goes in for optical mixture. He puts a little teeny touch of red on his canvas, and then a teeny touch of blue, and then the eye, from some distance, mixes that into a purple. He becomes very, very conscious of the kind of halo that a form has round it. And he explores that, which is a natural phenomena in some of his painting. And one can see him as a pointillist or a divisionist. Those are the two ordinary names for Seurat's formal movement, pointillism or divisionism. But much more important, I think, is again an influence which goes back to the early Renaissance. We know that he looked at Piero della Francesca, at least copies of Piero della Francesca. But what is really important is that he moves from doing paintings which are related to Millet, to doing paintings of suburban Paris, to doing paintings of the proletarian poor, to doing paintings of industrial suburbs, which have a kind of monumentality and simplicity of contour, of volume, of shape, of meaning. Here are the genteel people going across the boat, going across the Seine in a little boat. Here's the industrial landscape of Asnières, and here are ordinary common people enjoying themselves with their dogs, stretched out on the grass, throwing their clothes anywhere, and then somehow nonetheless becoming like Hellenic sculptors' work, the work of the 5th century BC, the work consciously and increasingly archaic. And one of the things that you have to think of is that primitivism becomes a powerful element in the art of the late 19th century. That desire to go back to the archaic, to the beginnings of art, the desire to escape from the center of bourgeois sophisticated culture. This is La Grande Jatte, which was an island again on the Seine, and this Sunday afternoon, and just ordinary people are going out enjoying them, and these ordinary people are themselves becoming like Cycladic dolls almost. They're becoming enormously simplified doll-like figures, obeying a horizontal vertical structure. If you ask, where does Mondrian come from? He comes from Cézanne. He also comes from Seurat. He comes from that re-exploration of those fundamental coordinates, which is just as important as the tessellated texture of the color in a Seurat. And here is Seurat just a little bit later, melding now in to the problem of color and the problem of formal arrangement by vertical and horizontal, the issue of movement. And this sublimely methodical man who would unroll his canvas and paint 8 hours a day with his nose perhaps 6 inches away from the dot, so that he could never see the thing till after it was done, paints nonetheless, tries to master not simply the world of color, but the world of movement in Le Chahut, and there we get the kind of repetition and the kind of forms which eventually lead to that sculpture by Boccioni. Is that not so? Let's have a look at the next. And certainly lead, here we see the pointillism, the divisionism, in a little preliminary sketch. Let's have a look at the next. Certainly leads again towards Cubism. If we look at the color up here in the famous Le Cercle, if we look at the reiteration of horizontal and verticals, if we look at the breakup of these top hats, it is not so far from Cézanne in color. Look at this area over here, for instance, and now let's have a look at the next, and we find it not to be unlike a Braque of 1909. Let's have a look at the next. We find it not to be unlike the very famous Picasso portrait of Ambroise Vollard. We find it to lead directly into the painting of 1910. Let's have a look at the next. And if we take the poseurs, we might even see that there's a relationship, not so much with Picasso and Braque, but eventually, let's have a look at the next, with Fernand Léger. Let's have a look at the next. That interest in ordinary people and the world of industry and geometry, which is implicit in the old Seurat, comes and is extremely explicit in the world of Fernand Léger. Let's have a look at the next. And so we can see that Seurat is an enormously important master. Another, come on, next please, another Léger. But if we look at this, which is a detail from the Grand Jatte, we might recognize that Seurat had a profoundly liberating influence on somebody quite else. Let's have a look at the next, and that is Giorgio de Chirico. Now, Seurat's paintings were not terribly well known. He wasn't the subject of anything like as many late retrospective and posthumous shows as Cézanne. But I don't think you can doubt for a moment his presence in Matisse. Let's have a look at the next. His presence in Léger, his presence in Picasso and Braque, his presence, come on, let's have a look at the next. Let's have a look at the next. Let's have a look at the next. His presence in de Chirico. Let's have a look at the next, because I want to show you, oh dear, I don't want to show you a Malevich. I want to show you, I don't want to show you white on white. I was going to show you the other side, starting off with the Potato Eaters by Van Gogh. But apparently it won't fit in. So we realize that Van Gogh, just like Cézanne, goes through a semi-impressionist phase in the early 1880s, and this is Montmartre, and there are elements of Impressionism involved here, particularly in the color. But let's think about Van Gogh as being the Dionysiac pole. Here he is in early work, and it's not Dionysiac at all. And I want you to contrast that, which is a watercolor of the north of Amsterdam. Let's have a look at the next, with what happens when he goes to the south. It is fascinating that, faced with the Mediterranean, Van Gogh suddenly becomes absolutely drunk. Now, that's physically as well as spiritually true. One of Van Gogh's great difficulties is that he drinks far too much in the late 1880s. He wants to paint all day, and red wine, coarse red wine, is what gives him strength. And so he drinks and drinks and drinks. But look at the rhythms, look at the excitement, look at the very, very different approach from the approach of Cézanne. An approach which is full of rhythms which become more and more and more riotous, an approach which is full of subordination of the self to the excitement of his internal feelings in the face of nature, losing, if you like, an intellectual control for a physical control. Let's have a look at the next. And you can see it becoming more extreme. Wonderful, wonderful painting, one of the greatest of all his paintings, making so much out of so little, and giving such a deep sense of excitement, of delirium, just to a few poppies and a little bit of grass and a single bird singing. Deliriously happy. Let's have a look at the next. And that sense of delirium, of excitement, of rhythm, the rhythm, here you see, still in the world of Cézanne, but the color is so much more excitable, and the actual corn itself suddenly begins to leap and turn and twiddle and twist, and you're in the middle of a musical world in which rhythm takes over the place of structure. And Van Gogh eventually becomes, let's have a look at next, totally rhythmic in his point of view. And here is a famous painting which he does just before he dies. And that famous cornfield, with its unabashed abandonment to pure color for its own sake, with its ferocity of rhythm, leads in its way, quite obviously, to the whole Dionysiac world of the 20th century. It leads, the Starry Night comes from somewhere. It comes from the mosaic world, which we've also seen influencing Klimt, though I don't think Van Gogh knew much about Ravanese mosaics. But it comes out of that world of color into another world of color, and into a world which not only contains color, but contains such a depth of inner feeling. The night cafe is also beckoning Vincent to the brothel, beckoning Vincent to some kind of haven from his own loneliness, but also beckoning Vincent to boredom. And the contrast of the light of the night cafe against the starry night itself, the contrast between art and nature, seen as something profoundly painful and profoundly deeply sewn into, not embroidered upon, but sewn into the structure and fabric of human life. And it is so obvious that those rhythms which appear in Vincent van Gogh are going to appear everywhere. And they appear in the shout of Munch, and then they appear, again, here's Vincent's Dr. Gachet, and you can see that Vincent himself has that inner psychological tension that you can also get in Munch. And remember that Munch starts painting in the late 1880s when Van Gogh is still alive, and paints his most important paintings in the 1890s, in the decade after Van Gogh's death. And there's another Munch, and here's another Munch. Obviously, Van Gogh is more pulled by Apollonian aspects than Munch is. And Munch is really interested in, and not merely gripped by, abnormal and disordered psychological and excited and horrified psychological tensions. But let's have a look at this, because of course Van Gogh round about 1900, becomes enormously important, just as Seurat and Cézanne. And Van Gogh becomes important upon Expressionists and Fauvists. And here's a fairly early Fauvist painting by the wild, rough motorcyclist and boxer Maurice Vlaminck, who, by the way, of course, comes from the same part of the world. And let's have a look at, again. And then the influence upon a huge range of German painters. Kirchner, Haeckel, Schmidt-Rottluff, Paula Modersohn-Becker, fine feminine painter, wonderful, what's her name, Gabriele Munter, the friend of Kandinsky, and here upon Emil Nolde. And you can see how close Emil Nolde in some of his landscapes, here's another Emil Nolde, is to Vincent van Gogh. And so we find ourselves in the 20th century at long last, faced with Apollo in the form of Mondrian, and faced with the descent from Mondrian. And I would ask you to think a little bit about what may have been in your minds perhaps too false a polarity. Non-figuration and figuration are very different things, but you may sense a fundamental feeling of the nature of the world behind Mondrian's asperities and rigid geometry, just as you may sense a sense of rigorous geometry behind the soft and miraculous bottles of Giorgio Morandi. And the 20th century is full of wonderful artistic contradictions. One of the last paintings ever painted by Seurat, and you see how that can then descend in a peculiar way into the world of Picasso, and then, more interestingly and more recently, into a very, very beautiful painting by the contemporary, fashionable, though now very old painter, Balthus. And I thought I'd like to end up with a few images, some of which are familiar. And we've looked at some Apollonian images. Here's another Dionysiac Van Gogh, which descends to the paroxysms of Francis Bacon, the English painter, who actually did a variation on the Van Gogh, which I simply couldn't find in the slide library, Van Gogh Going to Work. And let's have a look at the next, which is another extraordinarily excitable and extraordinary Bacon of a dog at street level, which may remind you of Goya's dog, on which it's surely based. Or this St. Mary Magdalene, which is based upon, amongst other things, Renoir's Parapluie, and which is, of course, a painting of 1960s aspidistras and horrors. And keep the horror flying and keep the aspidistra flying. Let's have a look at the next. We must remember that the history of 20th century art is so checkered and so complicated, and it can give you as well as frights and a terrible, excitable mental exchange, mysteries, he can still also give you sweet and charming paintings like this Bonnard interior. And perhaps most of all, it can give you its wry comment on itself. Roy Lichtenstein, a cow going abstract. Let's have a look at the next. And the cow, as you can see, has gone a little bit more abstract. There are its horns. Here's its udder, perhaps. And then the cow in the triptych. Let's have a look at the next. Now, totally abstract. But that abstract cow can then become a boat. Let's have a look at the next. Lionel Feininger's boat. And from Lionel Feininger's boat, it can become the extraordinarily beautiful boats of Seurat. And then you and I and it and everything can float away on a dazzling yachting ship with Rao Dufi. And I thought I should end on a light and gay and rather Santa Cruzan note. Thank you very much.